My name is Chris, and today we're taking a look at the Denafrips Pontus II DAC. Welcome to the Vinyl Attack. Denafrips have been producing high-quality DACs for some years now. Their affordable and incredibly popular model, the Aries II, has been a mainstay in the best performance-to-dollar ratio category for almost that same time. The amount of ingenuity and engineering that went into the Aries II has been long touted by the overwhelming majority of the audiophile community as being simply fantastic. If you haven't seen my review of the Aries II, I would recommend that you do so, and not just to pad my runtime. That review gives a solid rundown of the technical components that make up that DAC. I bring this up because of the remainder of this review, I will be referencing the former. While there are certainly several differences between the two, there are also several similarities, many of which will be found in the performance number of each DAC, that is to say, the bitrate, sampling, and so on. As noted in the previous Denafrips review, the prices listed on their direct-to-consumer website are in Singapore dollars. Additionally, since my review of the Aries II and my receiving of the Pontus II, Denafrips have released their 12th anniversary editions of both DACs. While the website does list a couple of minor upgrades to each unit, the following review will still be applicable to both the sound and performance of the Pontus. The Pontus II comes in at roughly $1,850 US. Your price may vary slightly due to the current global exchange rate, but for the sake of this review, we'll just run with the average number of $1,850. I mention this for two reasons. Firstly, I simply want you to be aware of the slightly fluctuating price potential. Secondly, because, as with the Aries II, which is perhaps the strongest performer under $1,000 on the market, the Pontus II is perhaps one of the strongest performers under $2,000. This gives us a general price range with which to work. Without diving directly into the performance of this piece, I do think the topic of price is relative to the discussion at this point. Quite simply, if you're not currently running a fairly resolving system, your money is simply better spent on the Aries II. Whereas the Aries II made a noticeable change on my lower range system, consisting of an Iota VX CD player and Q Acoustics 3030i stand mount speakers, as well as my mid-tier system of the Hagel H90 integrated amp and Buchart S400 Mark II speakers, I feel the improved performance of the Pontus will be lost on the former components, at least in terms of money spent to achieve it. In my time with the Pontus, it simply begged to be played on the higher-end components I currently have in home for review. Speaking of which, for this review, I made use of a Hagel H390 integrated amp, which comes in at around $6,500, a pair of Buchart S400 Mark II bookshelf speakers, which retail for roughly $2,300, a Bluesound Node 2i streamer to source the online digital music, not that expensive, but just used as a source, an AudioQuest Cinnamon Toslink cable, AudioQuest Golden Gate RCA interconnects, and AudioQuest Rocket 33 speaker cables. While I do currently have a pair of Alta Audio Alyssa bookshelf speakers in-house, which retail for about $5,000, and gave them a brief listen with the Pontus, they're not yet quite broken in, so I won't be speaking as much to their sound performance with this DAC. As before with the Aries II, the Pontus II came in an unassuming box with nothing more than the unit itself. There are no printed instructions, there is no remote control, and there wasn't even a power cord. When I contacted Denafrips to inquire about this missing cord, their logic was simply that at this price point, the likelihood of an owner already having an IEC power cord was almost a certainty. Additionally, they felt strongly that an audiophile hobbyist purchasing a unit at this price point would almost likely be using an upgraded power cord as well. I found this to be a very clever way to save money for the manufacturer, and I tend to agree with their logic. Setting aside the controversial topic of upgraded cords and cables for the moment, how many IEC cords do you have laying around your house right now? I know I can think of at least a half a dozen off the top of my head over here. Measuring from the faceplate, the Pontus II comes in at roughly 13 inches wide by 13 inches deep and 4 inches tall when measuring from the feet to the top. Its all-metal case construction and high-quality components inside bring the total weight to almost 19 pounds. This stout, hefty build is just the first of the many indicators that speak to the quality of this unit. Under the hood, you'll see what is essentially double the horsepower, to coin a phrase, that you'll find in the Aries II. Instead of one dual ladder configuration of resistors that make this an R2R ladder DAC, you'll find two. Rather than one O-ring transformer to bring balance and power output and lower the noise floor, you'll find a pair. While I didn't count the total amount of Nichicon filter caps in the Pontus, I wouldn't be surprised if they double in number as well from the Aries. Does this mean that you can expect double the sound quality? That's not really how this works, but their attention to detail in trying to lower said noise floor and increase performance is more than noteworthy. For example, with this model, as opposed to the Aries, you'll find that Denafrips have cleverly put the power components on the bottom of the board to keep them separate from the more sensitive electronics on top. This design goes one step further to help reduce unwanted noise. They've also made it easier to use and understand the interface. Rather than needing to go through several different sequences of button presses to sort the oversampling and non-oversampling modes, you can now simply press a clearly marked button. You also have easily accessible input selectors and a phase button right at your fingertips. While you do have to use the mute button in conjunction with the mode button to toggle the slow and sharp filter, I didn't find that to be much of a detractor, as once I chose the setting I liked, I simply left it. The 12th anniversary edition of the Aries II has now included a simpler button interface as well, but at the time of my reviewing, that wasn't the case. Something they couldn't add to the Aries II with the latest update, however, were the additional connections found on the Pontus II. Around back, you'll find 2 coaxial inputs, 2 AES inputs, which look like XLRs and use that type of connection, but are in fact digital, 1 optical, 1 I2S, and 1 USB Type-B input. For the analog connections, you'll find 1 set of balanced XLR outputs and 1 set of single-ended or unbalanced RCA outputs. Do note that both of the analog outputs are in fact shared, so only use one of them at a time. Don't connect a set of XLR cables to one component and a set of RCA interconnects to a different component. For the technical output numbers, I'm going to be lazy and simply refer you to my aforementioned Aries II review. All the specifications on the Pontus II are the same on the Aries II, with the exception of being able to use up to DSD-1024 on both the USB and I2S ports, not just the USB connection as found on the Aries. So then that must mean that they sound identical considering the numbers are the same, right? Not even remotely. This is where measurements just aren't able to tell you the entire story and you simply have to listen. So, what indeed did I hear from the Denafrips Pontus II? The first word that comes to mind, the first thing that I noticed, was imaging. The Pontus II, in conjunction with the Hegel H390, was simply able to showcase with pinpoint accuracy the location of each instrument being played. The most subtle of spaces between each instrument was incredibly easy to pick out. There was a noticeable separation between them, and the impossibly black background made them as appears that they came out from nowhere, not from 2 speakers placed in a room. Upon recommendation from a recent Rick Beato video about high-quality audio recordings, I spent a fair amount of time with the Memoirs of a Geisha soundtrack as composed by the legendary John Williams, whose birthday was actually just this past Wednesday. The combination of traditional Japanese instruments, coupled with the more common orchestral instruments played by renowned musicians Itzhak Perlman and Yo-Yo Ma, look them up, made brilliant use of the Pontus II's ability to separate one instrument from another. On many of the tracks, the different drums being played were not only easy to identify amongst each other, but sat just uniquely apart enough to have their own identity, their own resonances and tones being nuanced yet keenly audible at the same time. Coupled with this was the outstanding soundstage. The height, depth, and width of the musical presentation far exceeded the limitations of the speakers themselves. The Hegel H390's ability to produce a soundstage that is noticeably taller than that of the H90 I usually employ was quite evident. But when compared to the built-in DACs of the Blue Sound node, the Aries II, and even the H390 itself, only the Pontus was able to take full advantage of this available height. It was simply able to produce sound in the areas that the other components couldn't. On top of that, the sound that was produced was more pleasing to my ears. The reverberance of the aforementioned Japanese drums rang pleasantly low with a great deal of body, their unique tone gaining that much more prominence from the accurate sound. The kick drum of modern rock recordings or vintage 80s rock such as Def Leppard, to whom I've been listening to quite a bit lately for some reason, felt visceral and had plenty of punch. Electric bass guitar became more of a showcase instrument no matter how simple the playing. It didn't take Geddy Lee or Billy Sheehan to make the instrument stand out. Grit and texture, when actually in the music, were at the forefront of the bass guitar. Growl and bite were the same. But not all bass guitars have this sort of attack. The smooth fingerstyle playing of Dennis Green on my many Blackthorn recordings flowed effortlessly from the speakers. His easy and thoughtful playing bringing attention to the widely capable sound and that you don't need to be a virtuoso to be an important component in the band. His playing added atmosphere and foundation to the music rather than just low notes. Overall, the bass performance just shined more with the Pontus II than with the other components, and it was a difference that I would now not want to be without. Male and female vocals alike stood out to me in the mid-range. I particularly noticed this with the Alta Audio Alyssa speakers. While they were not overly forward in any way, they had an abundance of presence in the mix. Jack Johnson's performance on Fragments in particular stood out to me. The mix was superb, and his vocal performance filled the room with its wide and holographic presentation. A valid concern may be that the vocals are too prominent and could overshadow the other instruments. This was certainly not the case, even though I don't know that I've ever heard them any more clear in my own home. Continuing with the mid-performance, acoustic guitars had shimmer when strummed and a subtle to sharp attack when being plucked, depending on the playing, of course. Rock guitars didn't just have bite, they had clarity, they had depth, and even warmth depending on the album. With the Pontus II's ability to showcase such a wide soundstage, I was able to hear and enjoy all of the albums I listened to in a new way. Pantera was still Pantera, but Dime's guitar wasn't just an abundance of gain. Everything from pinch harmonics to dive bombs were simply more audible and enjoyable. Not something I really ever thought I would be saying about his playing, as it can certainly melt your face. Unsurprisingly, the high-end performance was just as precise. The chimes on the Jennifer Warnes' song, The Panther, were unbelievably crisp and clear. Again, the imaging put them in a space all their own, and soundstage made them seem as if they were coming from an adjacent room. Art Blakey cymbals were splashy when they needed to be, tight and dry when that was what was called for, and sparkling all around. This, of course, comes from the different cymbals being played in a particular song, and the Pontus made it easy to pick out which was which. I was particularly fond of Mike Portnoy's ride cymbal on the first few tracks of the sophomore release of 2020, shown in Roman numerals on the album cover, from Sons of Apollo. If you haven't listened to them, do so. The transients and decay easily brought out the differences in his playing one part of the cymbal to another. The fat ringing tones of the bell area and the tighter ping of his stick attacking the outer edges were again clear and identifiable. The high-end performance made instruments bright and clean while never being forward or harsh. This being of the utmost importance to me. One of my pet peeves with many digital sources and music playback is how forward and how harsh they can sound. The Pontus II never suffered from this, and I can certainly say that I was never at a loss for hearing detail. Quite the contrary. The Pontus puts out an amazing amount of detail, and when I say that, I'm not talking about high-end performance. Many people seem to equate detail with a product's high-end or treble performance. These are two separate things. When I say detail, I'm talking about the extra information that is revealed from the instruments that are playing. Notes from a guitar you didn't hear before. Texture and resonance of a bass you hadn't noticed. The airy presence of vocals that surround you in a way that they hadn't before. The subtle nuances that are now making themselves known to you for the first time. The Pontus II has that detail in abundance. So with all of that, what didn't I like about the Denafrips Pontus II? As you might guess, not much. But for me, they were indeed valid concerns, at least at this price point. You see, for almost $2,000, I would really like to see a remote control. That may or may not be vital for you, and I'm sure some of you will just tell me to get off my lazy fair point. But laziness has nothing to do with it. After all, I'm an analog guy. Everything I do involves me getting up out of my chair to play music. But that's kind of the point. Being able to stream music digitally from my phone, which acts as a remote control, to an amp that has a remote control, it would only stand to reason that my DAC, my $2,000 DAC, should have one as well. My second problem with the Pontus II is its lack of optical inputs. Having one optical input, in my opinion, is a huge miss. Currently, I don't know anyone who prefers to use coax to Toslink, and yet there are two coaxial inputs and only one optical. This should be the other way around. I would very much like to hook up my CD player and my streamer to this DAC, but until I buy additional cables, that simply won't be possible. Having to spend additional money after spending nearly $2,000 on a component is the last thing I'd want or should have to do. Again, just another miss. So that brings us to my rating and my overall thoughts on the Pontus II DAC. After much deliberation and going back and forth between two possibilities, in the end, I awarded the Denafrips Pontus II DAC the red seal. Why was this close? Quite frankly, it came down to the two main caveats I mentioned. When spending almost $2,000, I think those oversights are just much more impactful than if I'm spending $800. But in the end, the exceptional sonic performance that this DAC brought to my space simply couldn't be overlooked. It was that impactful. If you're looking for an outstanding sound and even a DAC that might be your very last, I would put the Denafrips Pontus II on a very short list. Its ability to bring out detail, precise imaging, superb soundstage, and evoke such a visceral feel and emotion from the music being played was nothing short of excellent. Thank you all of my patrons on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thanks to you for stopping by to watch, and I look forward to next time.